Hey everyone, it's Ham Alejandro, and you're listening to the Arts Calling podcast, the place where I interview hardworking independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. Now, if you could please do me a favor, be sure to stop by the episode description and check out this week's shout out. Each week, I feature a new project from friends of the show and previous guests, so be sure to click on that link and support independent creatives. Now, let me tell you about our guest. Today, I'm delighted to be arts calling Kate Brandis. Kate lives in the small river town of Riegelsville, Pennsylvania, with her husband and 2 sons. She's a creative writer and artist interested in sense of place. Kate has also worked as a geologist and environmental scientist for more than 20 years. She currently teaches geology, creative writing, and a course on landscape, culture, and story of place at Moravian University. She also co-directs the Moravian Writers Conference. Her latest novel, Stone Creek, is now available. Now, folks, you're in for a treat. This was a wonderful conversation with Kate about the convergence of the many aspects of her life as an educator, a scientist, and an author. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time getting to listen back to this one because there are so many timely discussions here about environmental concerns, but also she's not sacrificing the drama of the characters and the story that she's trying to tell. So without further delay, let's give Kate a call. Hi, Kate. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How about you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Here in Wyoming, it's a little bit too warm for my liking, but how is it going over there in your neck of the woods?
Good. I'm in eastern Pennsylvania, and it has been a very hot summer here for a very long time. So I hear you on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So before we get into your work, I'm really excited to talk about Stone Creek, which is the new novel that you are bringing into the world. But let me
Mhm.
ask you a few questions about you, because I kind of like to get a sense of where you're getting started as a creative, which is kind of a complex question, I imagine, because you're a scientist
Yeah.
and you're also an author, and I think that's a wonderful blend. So maybe we could start there. Let's talk about what led you to writing, because it was a new discovery, right? Relatively?
Yeah. I'm 52 now, and I've been writing since I was in my mid 30s. So it's been, some time, but it definitely took me a while to get there. And I have worked as a scientist. I still work as a scientist. I teach geology and climate change and things of that kind right now. But I have always been a reader of fiction. I've always loved fiction from a very young age. And looking back, I didn't know this at the time, but looking back, I always sort of interpreted my life and my experiences through stories that I was reading, other people's stories, and sort of sharing that. I think as I was reading fiction growing up, and I still think this, I think, reading other people's stories makes our world, like the reader's world, so much bigger. And I've always just really loved that. But I never considered myself trying to do something like that until I was in my mid 30s. And, I've talked about this before. It was sort of timed with the birth of my first son. I have 2 kids, 2 sons. And I was at the busiest time in my life. I was working full time, had a newborn baby, all of these things. But I was really somehow excited about learning to do creative writing. I don't really know exactly why. I was talking to someone else about this, and they were sort of talking about their own experience, and they also came to creative writing later in their lives, and they said that they just didn't have anything to say really until that point in their
Mm.
lives. Like, and I think maybe that's true for me. Like, I just maybe needed enough
Mhm.
experiences to be able to have stories to share. That said, it took me a heck of a long time to learn to do it. I mean, not that I'm still learning for sure, but that's hopefully makes some sense.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the most important things that ever happened to me was having a child. And then I realized, that's putting my entire life into context. And maybe now I can understand how
Yeah.
it is that I need to process my life, and it's a really beautiful thing
Yeah,
when kids come into the world and give you that perspective.
for sure.
But as you as you begin this exploration of science that seemed to begin at a younger point in life, right? Like an
Hmm.
earlier stage, I noticed that there was in this interview that you talked about, you referenced a magnolia tree, and I thought that was such a beautiful thing that you shared of a memory. Could you elaborate on that a bit? Because I love that sort of, if you can remember that anecdote.
I'm not sure I can remember the anecdote,
Oh,
but
okay.
I certainly can remember why I would have been speaking about a magnolia tree. It's we all have these memories, I think, in our lives that are sort of very prominent for whatever reason. And when I was very young, I lived in New Orleans, and this magnolia tree. I lived in an apartment. This magnolia tree was growing outside of our apartment complex, and really, one of my earliest memories is being in that tree and studying and examining like the deep green, glossy leaves and the beautiful white blooms of the magnolia flower. And I remember all of these ants crawling all over the place. And so it's just an image that really, for whatever reason, really struck me. And I can even like put myself back there. And I'm not someone with like a
Mm.
super great memory of events, but I can remember that moment really well. And so, I always think that's somehow significant. Like if it's come
Mhm.
into your consciousness like that, there's a reason for it, even if I don't exactly know what it is. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so you were drawn from an early age, at least to the environment, or at least a sense of place, right? You were trying to find
Mhm.
nature within your environment. And when did you decide to pursue this path of environmental science or geology? What do you feel like there was a through line from those kinds of memories early on, or was it just a more logical decision of like, oh, this could be something good for me to pursue and kind of look at?
Well, it doesn't make for a very tidy story, my interest in geology. I mean, I guess in retrospect, I can understand some of these things, but certainly at the time, when I decided I was going to be a geologist, I was in a senior in high school. I had a teacher who I was a little bit afraid of, and he was making the whole room go around and talk about what they were going to do when they went to school, in college, and I had to come up with something, and I was very very shy at the time. I did not like speaking aloud in class at all, so I felt this great pressure.
Mm.
Um, and I just said I would be a geologist when it became my turn, and I don't exactly know why I said that. I um, didn't know anything about what that meant at all. But it also stuck, like, for whatever reason. Like, I think maybe some internal piece of me just was having to speak in that moment. And like, I somehow knew. I can't explain it. But I went to school and did that. And I never strayed. Like, I never decided, oh, that's not my path. And I have said this. I think the science of geology is an interesting science. It has story built into it, and so like again in retrospect, I can see that I've described, and I tell my students this when I teach geology, that there's layers of rock, right, and we can know the Earth's history by looking at those layers of rock and thinking about them as pages of a book, and that's really true. Like every layer tells us something about what was happening on the Earth at that time. It's like a storyline, and so I was very drawn to that. I'm drawn to the idea. I love geology because it kind of marries. There's a visual portion. There's a story element. There's a conceptual like piece of putting it all together. It's a whole system of thinking. So very different from like a laboratory experiment, maybe in physics, where you're in the lab and you're doing these very precise things. You're really thinking about a system when you're thinking about geology, um, and also sort of that story connection. I don't hopefully I'm making
No,
sense.
that's it's no, absolutely, and I love that. This is a perfect segue to the work that you started doing in writing because I believe I saw that your first novel, The Promise of Pierson Orchard, was very much about that conversation or the beginning of that conversation that you would have with the environment almost as a metaphor for family conflict and that sense of place. And I love if you could talk a little bit before we get to the latest one about how that first novel sort of cemented some of these ideas, solidified some things in the way that you saw yourself as a writer coming out of that? Because I think there was a lot of learning experiences from that, from what I gather.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess sort of fundamentally, if I'm just going to look at the really big picture, one of the things that as a scientist, I teach now at a university, but most of my career has not been doing that. I've been, I would say, sort of a translator between communities who have a problem, like an environmental problem, and, you know, um, the government or whoever is trying to make a decision for that community. So I've been the one who can interpret the science for people who need to have that understanding. That's been my primary role for many years. Um, and I've been, of course, I am a lover of nature. I love the environment. I do feel passionately about clean water, clean air, that sort of thing. And throughout all of that work, and even in my teaching now, the science, the facts and figures only go so far in reaching people, and they only reach so many people. And so from early on, and maybe because of my experience reading fiction and knowing how powerful a story can be, I got interested in, if I was going to do creative writing, I wanted to do it in a way that maybe opened up and these environmental issues to a greater population, and dealt with those topics in a way that was nuanced, right? Now, there's not a clear answer a lot of times. And so I wanted to be able to share art, writing that, helped people discuss those
Right.
things. Yeah.
That's something that really caught my eye as I read the description of the Promise of Pierson Orchard because, I'm from Wyoming, so there's fracking is a constant issue here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of coal mining happening in our state
Yeah.
because we're so resource heavy. But
Hmm.
these are the conversations that are so difficult to have because folks who have imbued their sense of culture and life into the work that is in a sense destroying the environment,
Hmm.
it's a very difficult conversation to have and try to balance it, and so I'm definitely looking forward to reading that one of yours. But if I may ask here then, as you, got that book out into the world, did you feel an urgency to just continue writing, or did you feel like you needed to take a break after Pearson Orchard?
That's a good question. I do take breaks from my writing. I mean,
Mhm,
it is an ebb and flow for me. When you're writing a
mhm.
book and then when you're marketing a book, as I'm doing now, and I did back then at the time that it was coming out, it takes time and effort and a lot of brain power. And so there are times when I don't write. I'm not someone who writes every day. I try to keep my toe in the water, so to speak, with a story I'm working on, but sometimes that's very small increments, as it is right now. For me, I'm working on a new book, but I'm not doing very much because I'm doing this other thing, trying to just get my current book out there. So I definitely sometimes take breaks. I've learned also, when I'm writing, I've learned the power of putting it away. I know this, I know that it's good to put away, but sometimes deadlines, you think you have to do this XYZ by now, and I've learned with at least the latest book that it's best to shut it all down, put it in a drawer, and come back in a month or two, even.
Right, right.
Because you see things, in a fresh eyes that way.
So, let's kinda take a look at the new book, Stone Creek. Has it been a work in progress for a long time? Did you feel like the story sort of emanated out of you, or was it a sort of like chiseling away and trying to figure out what it was going to be for a while?
It was definitely figuring out what it would be for a while. I've been working on it for 7 years, so I mean, and that's just how long it takes me to write a novel. I thought maybe I would be faster the second time around, but it's not true. I think many people will say that. Um, so I knew kind of conceptually, like, I wanted certain elements. I do love. I write about small towns and rural places. That is the world that I live in and kind of know. Um, and I wanted it to have some environmental aspect of it too. I really love family drama, so very much similar to my first novel, it has those elements. So it's the same core elements there, although quite a different story and completely different cast of characters. And but it took me a while. I think with both my books, interestingly, my first impulse has been right. And I can only say that now in retrospect. And, my first impulse has been right. And then I've strayed from it, uh, several times, but I've come back to it. So, I mean, I think the lesson for me maybe going forward is to trust myself a bit more. Not that it's going to make a shorter process, but I think that that's what I've learned with the second one here.
Can you tell me a bit about Tilly Stone, who's your protagonist in Stone Creek? She's such a phenomenal character. There's so much heartbreak chasing her around, and I'm curious if you could introduce us to this character and let us know where we find her at the beginning of the story. It's so compelling and so exciting, but also
Sure.
really sad sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Thank you. Um, yeah, Tilly Stone, she's the protagonist, as you mentioned, and she is raised by her father, who is an eco-terrorist. And so until she's 13, she and he are kind of living on their own, very isolated lives, and they're blowing up dams. So dams along, all around the Northeast is sort of a statement, a political statement, social justice kind of
Mm,
a statement. And her Tilly, up until she's 13, she only knows this life. So she's very isolated in terms of her worldview because she really only has her father's viewpoint. And she doesn't even know what they're doing is like kind of wrong because she really has not seen any other perspectives. So she's very isolated. So that's how she grows up. Her father, when she's 13, decides that she should have a kind of a more normal life. And so he decides they're going to stop doing that and kind of begin a life, sort of start fresh in where he grew up, Stone Creek, the name of the book. And so the story opens actually with her as an adult, um, 30 years old, and she's been living in Stone Creek. Her father has long disappeared. He does leave her, abandons her when she's 13. So the story opens when she's 30. She's trying to make a life. She's not doing very well. He shows up and is about to mess up everything that she's been working for. So that's the way the book opens.
yeah, and it's such a clever way to establish how family can sometimes come and throw a wrench into things as you're trying to do the right thing or go the right path. But it definitely has this feeling at the very beginning, like something is just haunting this poor woman who just
Yeah.
wants to, build a semblance of normal. But when he shows up, everything just breaks loose. And I had a wonderful time getting through that story and experiencing it. But as we get into this topic of her father, he's a very complicated figure,
Mhm.
but I'm curious if you could give us a sense of what it took to shape this individual because he is, as I said, very complex, but maybe if you could elaborate a bit on what it means to be an eco-terrorist and what kind of work went into defining that for your purposes of the story and how that affected the drama because it's such a potent addition to the plot.
Yeah, thank you. And that's I wanted to write about. I'm interested in subculture and kind of extremism in some ways, and so I wanted to write about that. And it was, one of the things that drove me to write the book is I just wanted to explore that and would it be like if you were, as Tilly Stone is raised, what would it be like if you're raised by one of these people in this sort of isolated culture, and what does it do to you? And Frank, who is the father figure, the eco-terrorist, he is a complicated person. He's not all bad at all, and he has his
Mm.
reasons, and they're very personal for what he does. But it makes, of course, he's a single parent in the book, more or less, and it makes his raising of a daughter in this lifestyle incredibly complex. And so that's their complicated relationship. And he's a good father in a lot of ways. But also the lifestyle they have to live is perhaps unfair for Tilly. So I love characters like this. I love complicated people. This is the way people are. So, for me, writing fiction is a little bit just exploring these complicated situations, topics, so that I can kind of understand them better for myself a little bit. So, anyway, a little bit about Frank. Yeah.
One of my favorite things about the work is how initially you do get the shock when her father Frank shows up that he is just coming in like a wrecking ball to destroy things once again, coming back from the shadows, from the dark, wherever he was. But you do such a wonderful job of sort of unspooling who this person actually is, and you see how complicated, and you see some of those motivations. And as somebody who was constructing this, how difficult was that to figure out how much to give of him right up front versus revealing sort of as you went in the story? Because I didn't get the sense that he was a nice of a person at the beginning, and I felt like I had to earn that, and it was so rewarding to just kinda sit with him for a moment and try to understand his perspective.
Yeah, I telling the story and revealing who the characters are, kind of when that happened in the story, that was one of the last things to come to me. The timeline, the story is told in a dual timeline. So part of the story, you are sort of witnessing what it's like for Tilly at 13, when she's with her father, when he leaves her, and then the other storyline takes place in present day, and trying to figure out how those two timelines came together and wove together were, I tried many things and undid, did, redid, but it didn't come to me until the very end, really, to how to put it together. So it was a
Mm,
late stage thing, and that was something, again, like all writers, we have readers, we want, we get feedback, um, and that helps to understand when you need to reveal something or what's not being communicated. Frank was, it took a while to make him a somewhat sympathetic character, because of what he does, and to try to explain a little bit of his backstory in a way that wasn't right at the front end, but you're sort of maybe wondering as the reader when, what's going on here. And hopefully, some of that backstory is revealed at kind of the right time.
yeah, and I'm curious for Tilly, kind of on the flip side of that, did you have any difficulty with the way that she sort of, found her way out of that relationship in a way, or maybe, like, found her own strength throughout the book? Because I feel like there was this very delicate sort of, like, push and pull with the 2 of them where, I think she has the opportunity to earn her freedom in a way, and so I'm curious how you negotiated that, how you worked your way to find that balance, because I thought that, it was really well done, that push and pull. What were the difficulties of creating the reality of that relationship?
Yeah, Tilly is 30, and I think when people are around that age, often there's a shift happening in sort of your understanding of your life. And so I did intentionally make her that age. And she's in a relationship in which she is indoctrinated, really, right? And so deeply indoctrinated until she's really like, she's really a teenager. She gets out of that. And I think when people are living in that kind of a world, it just takes a really long time to shake that from your psyche, and so
Mhm.
I hoped to kind of portray her in that way, that she really, even at 30, she's really still struggling with that, and really had to come and meet him face to face and kind of reconcile her past with him in this personal way, to be free of him. And so I hope
Mhm.
that's what I intended, that she really was never going to be free of him until she kind of came came and they talked, in a meaningful way, and she sort of figured out how she felt about him. So
Yeah.
yeah.
She's such a great character. I felt like I was definitely empathizing her with her the entire way. And you set these folks in such a wonderful backdrop. I think it is a reflection of sort of your the way that you understand and appreciate the environment that really like firmly places them in situations and locales that are very real. And so I'd like to talk about Cottersville, maybe what that inspiration was, how you started defining that landscape for them because they belonged and, yes, maybe they were at odds with the landscape every now and then, but if maybe you could give us a sense of what it took to create Cottersville and, some of the other locations that you, put your characters in.
Sure. I guess I can say that place for me and sort of setting is extremely important, and I'm always really focused on it. And I always feel like it's an important part of my stories. And I think in part, I'm a little obsessed with the idea and the concept of home. And
Mhm.
that's, I think, associated in part with my upbringing. I was shifted around a lot as a kid. I was born in North Carolina. As I mentioned, I went to, lived in Louisiana for a while, lived near Nashville, Tennessee for a while, went and lived in Youngstown, Ohio, landed in Pennsylvania later, moved a lot in all of those various places. And so when I got to Pennsylvania, which is where my family is really from, like if I go back to grandparents and great grandparents, I
Mhm.
did feel a bit of a sense of home. In my early years, I lived in a lot of urban environments, and it wasn't until I moved to Pennsylvania that I really moved into kind of a rural environment and felt like, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be. Um, and so I live now in a town called Riegelsville, Pennsylvania, which is eastern Pennsylvania. We have one traffic light. It's a very small town, surrounded by forest and farm fields, and it's really like what I based the setting of the story on. My own town. There's a in the story in Stone Creek. There's a cemetery with a wall around it in sort of the middle of town, and the same thing is here. I walk my town a lot. Very involved. I love being here, and I know all my neighbors, and so I wanted to kind of bring that into the story. I really couldn't help it. It's what I live day to day, and so I really couldn't help doing that. But it's a little bit of a love letter in some ways, in that way, to my town, my home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that about the book. It definitely resonates, and I keep saying this because, I was raised in a small town, with a handful of stoplights, and reading something like this, if you, substituted the forest for the prairie, you would get Wyoming, but there is that sense of awe for landscape, for, sort of the world around you, and you captured that so clearly and beautifully in this book. And as we get to the process of working on the novel, you've put some years into it, and now you're ready for it to see the world. Can you share a bit about what that process was like compared to your first novel? What were some things that you were implementing as you were getting Stone Creek out into the world?
Well, I mean, both of my novels, they're published by the same publisher, Wyatt McKinsey Publishing, which is a little publisher out of Oregon. But both took quite a while to get there. With my first book, I did the usual, queried a million agents and small presses and et cetera, and did get a relationship and a contract with Wyatt McKinsey in Oregon. And then for my second book, I was hoping to continue that right away, but it just took a while. It took a while for the book to really be ready. And I mean, I couldn't see that going along the way. I think it's very hard for writers to see when we're done and when we're not done.
Yeah,
So it just took a while. And I'm happy that it took a while. I'm happy for all the rejections that I got, and this isn't quite there. Because it wasn't until it was. So that was the journey. I didn't know that it would be published by the same publisher. My second novel would work out, but it did. So I'm happy. I love them. They've been wonderful.
yeah. Were there substantial revisions after the fact, like when you were working with editing, like that you had to come back to the drawing board and make substantial changes, or were there some things that you care to share about sort of that negotiation of the adjustments?
For the most part, no, because I had worked on it so much. But I did change the ending quite a bit at after it was slated for publication, and to the better of the book, for sure. Yeah, there needed to be a little bit more resolution. So, yeah.
Right. You tied the bow quite nicely there, at the end, and this podcast is free of spoilers, so we're not we're not gonna get into it, but I definitely urge folks to check it out. Now, I'm curious of your personal thoughts on being a steward for our environment and taking it to that extreme. What were some things that changed in your thinking about, sort of protecting the environment? What are the lengths that people go? And maybe this is the question, did writing the book change your perspective on how fiercely we must go to protect the environment, Or what was sort of the debate in your mind about it post novel?
Yes, this is a good question, and I don't know that I have a very tidy answer. I will say that I think, having been working in the environmental field for a heck of a long time now, 30 years really, I once, a very smart person once said to me that environmental change for the better, environmental good is done at all levels. There's a role for every person. If it's like the grassroots, a person who's just testing their own local water, it can be, local government, it can be state government, it can be federal government, it can be a personal thing, that all levels are important. So I have definitely in the novel, I feature an environmental extremist. Would I say that that's a good idea? I don't know, but I think there's a role in some ways. Sometimes extreme. I mean, the my character doesn't hurt people. So there's that, and I would not, of course, be interested in anybody hurting anyone. But
Sure.
sometimes I do think that extreme things cause a certain kind of change, and so I don't think it's. I think, as I mentioned, I think there's a full range, and
Of course.
things are
Yeah.
effective in
Not to
different
say
ways. Yeah,
Yeah, not
I
to
don't
say
want to
that the
be.
novel is advocating for
No.
anything of that nature, for sure not.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's an interesting conversation because,
Yeah.
as you say, you paint such a clear picture of somebody who has defined their motivations, and they're not sort of this black and white villain. They're a very complicated figure, and so
Mhm.
for people to read that character, I think it definitely posits questions about, are we doing enough? I
Yeah.
guess maybe that's sort of the end
Yeah.
goal there.
And I think that, it's true that people who are working for the environment or working really on any topic, sometimes, any passion, it can feel so slow and it can feel so hard sometimes that I think it is sort of human nature, whether you act on it or not. Sometimes we all have thoughts of like, well, I just wish I could do this, and you can't
Mhm.
because it's like out of sort of social structures. But my character, Frank, does not believe in normal social structures. He's ready to, break out of them. So it was just, interesting to think about that.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating read, but I definitely think that once it comes out into the world, because it's coming soon, right? I was very fortunate to read the pre-release copy. So thank you so much for doing
Oh,
that.
absolutely. Thank you for reading.
I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions about the book, and then I just want to be grateful for your time and don't want to keep you all day. But do you feel like as an educator, like, you were trying not to preach something throughout the book? Did you ever have a hesitation to say, "I'm putting too much in here that is slowing down the progress of the narrative?" What were those moments like? If you have any examples or maybe some things that you felt, "I need to pull back on this because it's not serving the story."
Yeah, I think both with my first book, The Promise of Pierson Orchard, which, as you mentioned, is about fracking, natural gas drilling, and it's a complicated process. Both that one and this one, there are reasons why people take dams out, environmental reasons, and it's sciency a little bit. So I definitely had to make sure that I didn't get bogged down in all of that technicality. And being more on the science minded, logical minded person, I do watch myself. It's interesting with Stone Creek. I think I did it too much, and some of my early readers were like, I don't understand what's going on with the dam. So I actually had to put some stuff back in there just to explain, what why they might be harmful, why people might want to take them out, those sorts of things. So um,
Yeah.
in a subtle way, so that it didn't feel like you're reading some technical document. It's actually part of the story.
Sure. That leads me to ask you about you're an educator as well, so I saw that you teach a course. It's landscape, culture, and story of place. I mean, that's such a great idea here to blend these things together. Were there some lessons that you acquired from your students or through having that kind of classroom work that informed the way that you went about your writing, or sort of epiphanies that came from the classroom?
I think for sure. That's one of my favorite courses to teach. Of the university I teach at, a lot of our students are local, and so we have Bethlehem Steel here, which is the Billy Joel song, "Well, we're living here in Allentown."
Oh, yeah.
Like that's where that comes from. He was writing about actually Bethlehem. Allentown's right next door, but he was writing
Wow.
about Bethlehem. Yeah. So that is like such a stamp on our landscape, and there's so many layers of change and story, and the way things look now very much related to even just that one this industry at the time. um, and so it's what's interesting is to take my students out who live in this area, who maybe oh wait, they've heard of that, but they have no idea of the layers of story behind that, and why um, the city now looks like it does because of the whole ramifications of all things associated with that large industry. So I think how it's related to the story, I am super interested in how a community, I think communities have different cultures, right? Depending on how they grew, who came there from early on. You can just drill down and you can find all these layers of story. That's the way I kind of think about landscapes in some ways. It's just, it's the land, but then it's, generations of humanity kind of on top of the land and over again, kind of erasing and redoing. But you can see evidence of all of them. So anyway, the Stone Creek, it has its legacy, also an industrial legacy that has shaped the place. And so in that way, it's definitely related. And it has changed, and people are reconciling sort of with the change, reckoning with the change a little bit. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating to hear you talk about geology and place in that way because whenever I hear you talk about it in that sense, I feel like, and this is probably a selfish perspective or a weird perspective, but it has a heavy dose of existentialism to me. Like, how do
Yeah.
you not get overwhelmed by the sense of time that's just unspooling in front of you and
Yeah.
like centering yourself back? I guess selfishly, I want to ask you, like, how do you deal with that? Or maybe it's just a me problem where I just see existentialism everywhere.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned time because, this idea of time and like deep time is so inherent in talking about geology. When we think about like how long have humans been around on the earth, it's such a tiny, tiny, tiny little speck of time in comparison to the age of the earth. So in some ways, I think because of my like geology training, and I know that, and I have an idea of what 4.6 billion years of the earth looks like that I can, again, reading those
Yeah.
rocks and, oh, here we are. We're just like the very surface of this time period. I guess the time doesn't bother me as much because I see our time here is so tiny and
Mm,
fractional,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
also significant. Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. We definitely are a species of consequence, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
But I just have a couple more here. Typically, I ask folks who are involved in so many things. You're a mother, you're an educator, you're a writer. You also do watercolors, which I meant to ask you about. Maybe let me ask you about that first, because the
Mhm.
other one gets a little bit heavy. How does that fit into the picture? Watercolors is such a beautiful kind of work, and I'm curious how that fits into your slice of creativity in your life.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. I just dabble. I'm not I'm just playing around, but it's actually I do it because I can finish a painting while I'm writing. So, these writing projects take years and years and years. But I can finish a painting in a day, so that feels very good. So it's almost like I write and I paint at the same time, and it's almost like I need to do the painting sometimes, and sometimes I'm painting more intensely just to have a little bit of a sense of accomplishment and like I finished something. Because for me, the writing can just go on and on, and feel like it can feel strange at times. So I like the painting. My Stone Creek, the cover is my painting. Actually, my publisher,
Oh, cool.
yeah,
That's great.
decided to put it on there. So yeah, that was kind of fun.
No, that there's something to be said about having those small wins that accumulate. They give you more momentum, right? As you're
Yes.
working for the marathon that is a novel. I mean, I can't imagine the fortitude that it takes to do that. I write plays, so like,
Hmm.
having a month for a draft is like torture for me. But
Yeah.
yeah, you're definitely a trooper for doing hundreds upon hundreds of pages. So the big question here that I wanted to ask you was about, it's again a selfish question, but I ask everyone about what it means to have a life well lived. Because for somebody like yourself who is doing so many things, as I mentioned, you're a parent, you're an educator, and a scientist, and doing so much, how have you defined for yourself what that means for you? What is a life well lived when you could get easily bogged down by one of the many things that you're doing, or by, again, maybe the existentialism of life or time or all kinds of things? What gets you through the day, and how have you shaped that perspective, if I may ask?
Sure. You know, I for whatever reason have always had a sense of a ticking clock. I mean, even from when I was like very young, I've always felt like I had a limited time, and that I wanted to make sure that I paid attention to the time I have. So even like, way back when I was a teenager, I was somehow aware of this. And certainly at this point, I think it's so important to enjoy life and to enjoy family. And I love to make lists. For some, I have lists sitting right here beside me. But I put at the top of my list that, I want to spend quality time with my family, and I want to pay attention to the world, to take a walk and really look around and listen to things, have my coffee on my front porch in a quiet way. Things I enjoy. Doing like Wordle with my husband at night, like that's something we enjoy together. And so those to me are like top priority. Those human moments and things that are meaningful to me, and being out in nature, extremely important for my well-being. There's a lot of other busyness, but I try to hold those things at the top and let the other things come. And I do have lists. I check things off, but I'm not going to check everything off my list. And it's okay as long as I sort of try to keep my eye on what's really important. Um, so yeah, it's a conscious decision every day. I really try to be intentional about life is short and I only have this much time, and I'm going to make sure that I pay attention to the things that resonate with me.
And that is a beautiful and useful note to end on. So I know that we could just continue, and I'm just scratching the surface, but I want to thank you, Kate, so much for, bringing this kind of work into the world that is not only an enjoyable read. These are wonderful, committed characters who are going through really complicated situations, but it's saying something that is so deeply important and that we need to talk about as a society, that I just want to thank you for that, because it's the more of those works that we have of yours, the better. So this is a very moving story, Stone Creek, and I hope that you folks check it out. And I am going to have links in the episode description so that people can check it out. But it's been an absolute pleasure, Kate, and I hope that maybe down the road we get to catch up again, when the next one comes out. I'll be here for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your very thoughtful questions, too. I really appreciate your time.
Wonderful. Well, I will let you enjoy your Sunday, and I hope you have a wonderful time, but I will be in touch on the internet, okay?
Sounds good.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Talk soon.
Bye bye.